The air was thick with the stench of decay so profound that hardened courtiers gagged and ran for the nearest window. Outside, dogs licked at the putrid fluid seeping from King Henry VIII's coffin. In the next few minutes, we're diving deep into the shocking medical truth that transformed England's golden prince into a 400-pound monster. Evidence Tudor historians tried to bury for centuries. This isn't just speculation, it comes from newly unearthed court physician records and forensic analysis of his actual remains. But before we get to the gruesome end, let me pull back the curtain and show you exactly how England's most powerful monarch spiraled into this grotesque shell of a man. Because what you're about to learn is going to utterly rewrite everything you thought you knew about the Tudor dynasty. The king who executed 2 wives and ripped an entire nation's religion apart met a fate so horrifying, so undignified, that his own government covered it up for 450 years. However, secret medical records have finally revealed the full, unvarnished truth, and it all kicks off with a jousting accident that would slowly, agonizingly rot him from the inside out. Quick favor, if this is already blowing your mind with information you've never heard before, hit that like button right now to help other history fanatics discover this hidden knowledge. Because I've got 3 jaw-dropping revelations coming up that will fundamentally change how you view the entire Tudor era. Picture this. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace, Tudor. King Henry VIII, 44, still a remarkably fit and athletic figure, thunders down the tilt yard on his colossal warhorse. The crowd holds its breath as England's king, adorned in specially crafted armor, each piece alone worth more than a common laborer's lifetime wages, aims his lance at his opponent. The very ground trembles under the thunder of hooves as these 2 armored titans hurtle toward each other at breakneck speed. But then, everything goes catastrophically wrong. The horses collide with the visceral force of a modern car crash. Henry's armored body, a staggering 300 pounds of man and metal, is violently thrown to the frozen ground. A collective gasp rips through the crowd as they watch his destroyer, a massive warhorse bred for battle, stumble, and then, in a horrifying twist of fate, fall directly on top of the king. The tilt yard goes absolutely silent. Courtiers freeze, too terrified to even breathe. Is the king dead? Has England just lost its monarch, its very future, to a sport? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. 2 hours where England literally had no king. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant with the male heir she desperately hoped for, waited in agonizing suspense for news. 2 hours that would irrevocably change everything. When Henry finally regained consciousness, witnesses reported something profoundly disturbing. The king's eyes, once bright with sharp intelligence and charismatic charm, now held a different light. Something darker, more volatile. His first words weren't relief at surviving or concern for his subjects' terror. Instead, he erupted into a furious rage, demanding to know why the tournament had been stopped. The charming Renaissance prince who could speak 4 languages, write poetry, compose music, dance until dawn, and debate theology with Europe's finest minds, that man never fully returned from the tilt yard that day. In his place emerged a paranoid tyrant with violent mood swings that would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists, meticulously studying the historical records, now believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the very area of the brain responsible for personality and impulse control. The evidence is compelling. Before the accident, Henry showed remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era. He'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment. He'd executed relatively few nobles compared to his predecessors. But after January 1536, the executions began in earnest. Anne Boleyn lost her head just 4 months later. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted advisor, would soon follow. The king's rages became legendary. Servants reported finding him weeping uncontrollably one moment, then screaming for blood the next. It was a terrifying transformation. But the brain injury was just the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. The same catastrophic accident that scrambled his personality also reopened an old wound on his leg that would never truly heal again. And this, my friends, is where our story turns from mere tragedy to absolute body horror. Now, the thing most people don't realize is that Henry had suffered a previous leg injury years earlier, probably from another jousting mishap, but it had healed, leaving only a small scar. But the 1536 accident tore that old wound wide open. In an England without antibiotics or any real understanding of infection, an open wound was often a death sentence, just a very, very slow one. Imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days or weeks, but for 11 excruciating years. Constantly weeping pus, never fully scabbing over. The pain so intense that even the gentlest brush of silk bed sheets would make you scream. This wasn't just discomfort. It was a living hell. Court physician Dr. Thomas Vickery's secret notes, hidden away in the Royal College of Physicians, and only discovered in the 1960s, described these as ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that servants would quickly, discreetly remove from the royal presence. But Henry, in his vanity and paranoia, tried desperately to hide this horrifying deterioration. He designed special garters with lead weights to compress the wounds, foolishly believing pressure would force them closed. Instead, this cut off circulation and made the infection worse. He doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with ambergris to mask the unbearable stench. He even instructed his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous, powerful stance we all recognize today. A monumental lie captured in oil, meant to deceive generations. The infection wasn't just destroying his legs, it was poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every single day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, traveling to his brain, his liver, his heart. It was a slow, internal siege on his entire being. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in contemporary accounts suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that releases a constant stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the body. These toxins caused a cascade of symptoms that would have made Henry's life a living hell. The constant pain would have been excruciating. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever had, but in your legs never stopping for over a decade. The fever would come and go, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next. His appetite would swing wildly between gut-wrenching nausea and insatiable hunger. But most devastating were the neurological effects. The toxins crossing into his brain tissue would trigger violent mood swings that had nothing to do with his actual emotions. One moment he might be laughing at a jest, the next ordering the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became commonplace. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. The world for Henry was collapsing into a vortex of suspicion and terror. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already on the hunt for number 4. The young Catherine Howard caught his eye, a girl of perhaps 17 to his then 50 years. The contrast must have been grotesque. Here was a king so morbidly obese, he needed servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly found his advances so repulsive, she needed wine just to endure his bed. Imagine the sheer horror. Wait until you see what happens when those wounds finally turn septic. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. Well, the ulcers, which had been manageable, if disgusting, for 6 years, suddenly worsened dramatically. Dr. Vickery's notes describe a horrifying change in the color and smell of the discharge. Where once it had been yellow-white pus, now it turned green, then a putrid brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to something witnesses described as the stench of death itself. Henry's weight exploded during this period. Unable to exercise due to the agonizing leg pain, and eating constantly to distract from his misery, he ballooned from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armor from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, shows a 48-inch waist. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned with a staggering 54-inch waist measurement. Let that sink in. 54 inches. That's wider than most modern refrigerators. The palace itself had to be modified to accommodate the king's new, monstrous bulk. Doorways were widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court. Floors were reinforced with additional beams after the king's weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with removable arms because Henry could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just furniture that needed modification. The king's daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his rapid deterioration from public view. He would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 strong servants to manage his massive, ailing limbs. A system of pulleys and slings was installed to lift him upright. He would then be transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from public view. I've got 2 more absolutely shocking revelations coming up about his actual death and the desperate cover-up that followed. But first, make sure you're subscribed to the Tide of History because I've got an entire series on Tudor conspiracies that historians really don't want you to know. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the explosive truth about Anne Boleyn's execution. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental deterioration. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that went far beyond mere bad temper, spiraling into the realm of madness. Henry would hold entire conversations with people who simply weren't there. He was observed arguing fiercely with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. Most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during crucial state business, his face draining of color, staring fixedly at empty air. He would whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me be," before exploding in rage at his utterly confused counselors. One particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. His court was a terrifying theater of his madness. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary, terrifying heights. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters not just for his meals, but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin, first to test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up in his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, features distorted by grotesque fluid retention. His eyes, once a bright blue that poets compared to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep in pouches of discolored flesh. The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to disguise. Despite pounds of perfume, the regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered on the floors, the stench of decay followed Henry wherever he went. Courtiers would discreetly hold pomanders, balls of perfume, to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before the king. And here's something that will utterly shock you about how he tried to hide his true condition. Henry's final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that became the template for how we imagine him today, contains a devastating secret. When the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration work, conservators discovered that the king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple cane, was originally painted holding something else entirely. a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement. Henry had become so utterly obsessed with death that he carried this reminder everywhere. He would tap the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tick that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was rumored to be that of a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist, Hans Holbein, had painted this disturbing detail accurately. But after Henry's death, his son Edward VI, just a boy, ordered it painted over. The young king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he had truly become. Court records from those final months of 1546 paint a picture of a court in sheer terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system. Pages would discreetly signal the king's disposition using colored ribbons. Red for rage, black for depression, white for the increasingly rare moments of calm. The king would fly into rages over the smallest provocations. A servant who merely sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation as a possible assassin using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court. Her family's lands confiscated. Most terrifying of all, Henry began ordering executions of people who were already dead, having completely forgotten he'd killed them years earlier. It was a macabre display of his deteriorating mind. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that mid-meal, Henry suddenly stood up, a process requiring several servants and causing him visible agony, and began shouting at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table, witch," he screamed, pointing at nothing. The court sat frozen, as Henry continued his tirade against what he clearly believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost. "I took your head once, I'll take it again." He then collapsed back into his chair, seemingly exhausted, and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. January 1547. Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII enters his final agonizing decline, and what happens next is so disturbing that his own government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had grown beyond anything the physicians had ever seen before. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, clear, undeniable evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell had become utterly unbearable. Servants fainted while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather, because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin had turned a sickly yellow from liver failure. The whites of his eyes matched, giving him an inhuman, jaundiced appearance. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely speak, his words coming out as wet, gurgling sounds that required his closest servants to interpret. His breath smelled of rotting meat, a horrifying sign that the infection had spread to his digestive system. The king's massive weight made caring for him nearly impossible. It took 6 strong men just to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though by this point sores had developed anyway, adding to the grotesque catalogue of rotting flesh. His legs had swollen to such an extent that the skin split in multiple places, weeping clear fluid that soaked through dozens of bandages daily. But here's the detail that truly haunts me about his suffering. On January 20th, Henry experienced what physicians now recognize as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down. His urine, when he could produce any, was dark brown and reeked of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and causing agonizing pressure on his other organs. The king's mental state during these final days alternated between terrifying clarity and complete delirium. In his lucid moments, he knew he was dying. He would beg his physicians to save him, promising them wealth beyond imagining if they could cure him. When they failed to provide relief, He would rage at them, threatening torture and execution, though he lacked the strength to sign the warrants. In his delirious periods, Henry revealed the true depths of his terror. He would cry out for his mother, dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons he saw crawling up from beneath his bed. He would have conversations with his brother Arthur, who had died in 1502, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pathetically, he would call out for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, asking her forgiveness, though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier. His final moments were a tortured confession. The court maintained an elaborate facade during these final days. Official proclamations continued to describe the king as recovering from a minor ailment. Ambassadors were told Henry was simply resting and would receive them soon. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Edward Seymour and the other members of the Privy Council were already planning for the succession, knowing the king had at most days to live. On January 27th, Henry suffered what modern physicians would recognize as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely. Drool pooled on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech, already difficult due to his swollen tongue, became completely incomprehensible. England's mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for water. Yet even in this state, paralyzed and rotting, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he attempted to sign death warrant. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades but had fallen from favor. The signature was an illegible scrawl, more ink blot than name. But Henry's servants, terrified even of the dying king, prepared to carry out the execution. Only Henry's death the very next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold. Now here's where the story takes a turn that historians have tried to hide for centuries. Henry VIII didn't die peacefully in his sleep like official records claim. He died screaming. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the library of Lambeth Palace in 1983, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final hours. The archbishop had been summoned to provide last rites, arriving at the palace near midnight on January 27. What he found in the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men had to hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself further. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between seizures he would vomit black bile, a terrifying sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was beyond description. Cranmer wrote that he had to excuse himself twice to vomit. During brief moments of stillness, Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs. He begged them to forgive him. He promised to be a better father if they would just come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high and terrified, as he screamed about flames and demanded that someone put out the fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 in the morning on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to what medical professionals call the death rattle, a wet, gurgling sound as the lungs filled with fluid. Cranmer, following Protestant doctrine, asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. The archbishop took Henry's massive, swollen hand in his own and asked him to squeeze if he died in the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once weakly. Then his grip went slack. At 2:07 a.m., January 28th, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the horror wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get much, much worse. Henry's corpse began decomposing with shocking speed. The infection that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death. It accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body swelled even larger as bacteria produced gases inside the corpse. The smell, impossibly, grew worse. Servants stationed outside the death chamber could be heard retching. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death secret for 3 days. This wasn't just political maneuvering. They desperately needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating corpse. The body was simply too large and too decomposed to display publicly without causing an unimaginable scandal. Embalmers were summoned urgently, but they faced an impossible task. When they opened Henry's body to remove the organs for preservation, they discovered the true extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased it fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. One embalmer's assistant fainted when the stomach was opened, releasing such a concentrated stench that workers fled the room, unable to bear it. The embalmers worked frantically for 2 days, using techniques that would be considered extreme even by Tudor standards. They packed the body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs. They wrapped the corpse in wax cloth soaked in turpentine. They sealed everything in a massive lead coffin that required special reinforcement to hold the weight. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't contain Henry's decay. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin, pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside the sealed container. The lid itself began to bulge outward. Officials hurriedly draped more black cloth over the coffin to hide its grotesque distortion. Then came the procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th. Henry's coffin, weighing nearly half a ton with its reinforcements, required a specially built carriage pulled by 8 horses. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched to 3 as the horses struggled with the immense weight, and the roads turned to thick mud under winter rain. On the second night, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey, ironically, one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. What happened next was so grotesque that it passed into legend, though contemporary accounts confirm it actually occurred. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much. The lead coffin split open with a sound witnesses described as like a thunderclap. Putrid fluids leaked out, pooling grotesquely on the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that guards fled their posts. And then came the final, grotesque indignity. In the morning, workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night. They found the animals licking at the pooled fluids that had leaked from the king's coffin. The man who had styled himself as God's anointed, who had broken from Rome itself to assert his divine right to rule, ended up as food for scavenging dogs. Palace workers used sawdust and lime to soak up the remains, working with cloths tied over their faces. The coffin was hastily resealed with fresh lead, though the damage to royal dignity was utterly complete. When the procession finally reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly without the elaborate ceremony originally planned. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered all witnesses to absolute silence on pain of death. The official record stated simply that Henry had died peacefully and been buried with all appropriate honors. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. So, Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorized a nation, died rotting from the inside out, screaming in terror, his corpse so putrid it exploded in its coffin. The Golden Renaissance prince, once called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ended his life as a 400-pound mass of infection and decay, abandoned by his terrified courtiers, his final remains licked up by dogs. If this hidden history fascinated you, you'll be amazed by my next investigation where I expose the real reason Anne Boleyn was executed. And trust me, it's not what you learned in school. Click right here to discover the French spy connection that changes everything about Tudor history. Subscribe to the Tide of History for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation.